Thanks for watching the show. If you like what you see, consider subscribing, commenting, and maybe even becoming a patron. Even just $1 goes a long way. Gotta tell ya, I never expected the Astrobot series to ever get its own standalone entry. I'm glad that it is getting one, don't get me wrong. It's really cool to see something like this happen since it's not super common to see big polished AAA platformers anymore. It's just not the move I would have thought Sony would make with Astrobot, of all things. I think it's fair to say that prior to that upcoming game, this series existed for the primary purpose of showing off hardware rather than being independent experiences. And I might be getting a little ahead of myself by saying that this early, but let's be real. These games are pretty much just tech demos. Especially the first two, the Playroom and the Playroom VR. But before we get into those, let's talk about Team Asobi and Japan Studio for a second. I brought this up before, but despite them being defunct, Japan Studio is still my favorite development studio in the industry. Their legacy has had a surprisingly lasting grip on AAA and indie developers alike, as well as just leaving a strong impact on their fans as well. I would genuinely be shocked if you specifically, yes you who are watching right now, decided to go through Japan Studio's Wikipedia page and didn't find at least one game that they either fully developed or just assisted with development that you like, maybe even love. And as said before in the last video I made on a Japan Studio game, I will talk about every game they've made or die trying. But only the games they fully developed that are under their label, because if I didn't, I think I would be dust before getting through even half of this list. Something else of note about this studio is that it was also made up of several different teams, like Team Ico, Project Siren, or the topic of today's video, Team Asobi. Now, Team Asobi was a fairly late addition to Japan Studio, and I wish I could say more than that about them, but the Astro series is legitimately all they're known for. They've never done anything else. I'll give them this though, and to play my cards a bit early, just like most of Japan Studio's lineup, the Astro series is definitely something worth talking about at the very least. Although I will say that statement comes with a bit of a caveat, but we'll talk about that way later. For now, let's sink our teeth into this series already, and we'll be starting with both the original Playroom and the Playroom VR because, being honest, I have barely anything to say about these, especially the Playroom. Hell, for personal privacy reasons, I can't, well, more realistically don't want to, even show you a lot of this game without using footage that isn't my own. And while I'm okay with doing that for short supplemental material in my videos, I'd hate to have to use too much. Beneficially for me, I don't need that much footage to work with for this game because what really is there to say about this? It's a bunch of very, very simple augmented reality games, most of which weren't even included at launch and have to be downloaded from the PlayStation Store. Thankfully they're free, but it's strange that these weren't just added in updates rather than having to go through the rigmarole of downloading them all one by one as DLC. And those games are fine, really. If I had to choose, the Ninja one's my favorite, and that's not saying much because it's just a simple auto runner. Also, this one is straight up just the Wii Remote stuff from Rabbids Go Home, like, almost exactly. But yeah, for the most part, this isn't really a game. It's just a short time waster to show off both the PS4's camera and the DualShock 4. On the slightly more interesting side of things, we have the Playroom VR. This also isn't anything to write home about, really, but it definitely has more going for it than the original Playroom for sure. For one, it has better presentation, which I guess is expected. When you're in VR, the cracks in the game's visuals become a lot more noticeable, as well as everything just looking more, well, I don't want to say real, since that doesn't feel accurate with stylized visuals like this, but you get what I mean, right? You feel more like you're actually there is what I'm getting at, so the illusion needs to be kept up better than in a normal game, hence the need for improved presentation. Moving to the topic of gameplay, it's definitely an upgrade over the original Playroom. I wouldn't say it's outstanding in comparison to other VR titles I've played, which to be fair isn't a lot, but it for sure still has more going for it than its predecessor. And just like its predecessor, the Playroom VR is a collection of minigames, although I actually have things to say about these ones this time, so that's an immediate step up. Not much more to say to be fair, but still. This is a very competently put together set of minigames, especially the asymmetric multiplayer ones, which would be even better if I had friends to play them with. I'm so lonely. For real though, the Playroom VR is miles ahead in comparison to the original Playroom because not only does it do a better job of showing off the tech it was made for, it's also just, you know, fun. My favorites of the bunch are probably the cowboy one and especially the ghost catching one. Reminds me a bunch of Luigi's Mansion, and that is a very good thing to be reminded of. Oh, and of course, how could I forget this next minigame? So if you've ever seen the next game I'm about to talk about in this very video, you might think this looks a bit familiar. And you'd be right, because this is a strange little predecessor, or maybe more accurately a try before you buy, for Astrobot Rescue Mission. It's so strange having played through both this and Rescue Mission because they're fairly similar, but there's also a lot of little things that are different between them. It's like, not a beta or alpha build of a game, but more like a pre-release demo or something where it's close to the final product, but if you have a keen eye you can spot some differences. The most noticeable are probably the enemies' designs. Rather than the more rounded design philosophy that Rescue Mission and Games Onward would take for the enemies, they're all very square. Or if you want to be pedantic, I guess they're very cube instead. Anyway, there's some more instances of this kind of thing in the minigame, but I'm pretty sure I got my point across already. Which, on that note, we should get into our next game and one of the two reasons you're probably here for, right? Astrobot Rescue Mission. There's something very fascinating about playing a 3D platformer in VR. And I guess to get it out of the way, I don't really have that much experience with VR. I was lent a friend's Oculus ages ago and thought it was neat, but it didn't really capture me. Fast forward to now, having PSVR, and man, do I enjoy this a lot more. Maybe it's just because I have a better selection or something, but I've been greatly enjoying a lot of the PSVR games I've played so far, even Doom 3, which is a game I otherwise think is horrifically boring. And of course that enjoyment extends to Rescue Mission. So let's talk about, anyway, what I'm trying... alright. Let's talk about our protagonist, Astro, first. This little dude is absolutely adorable. It's like he was created in a lab to be one of the cutest things ever, and they somehow actually succeeded in doing so. He's wildly expressive with so little detail, and his proportions make him come off as soft and squishable despite the fact that he's, made of metal. So simple, yet so very appealing. You couldn't ask for a more endearing protagonist for a game. And he's not the only thing in this game that's looking good. The Playroom VR was already a step up from the original Playroom visually, but this game just looks nice. Especially for what I've seen of PSVR so far. From the selection I've played and the clips I've seen online, PSVR games tend to not look awful per se, but usually have downgraded visuals from either their PC counterparts or just from other traditional games on the PS4. Which makes this game all the more special because it looks fantastic for the most part. You can tell Team Asobi knew what limitations they were working with here, and they knocked it out of the park. And to see this kind of polish on a 3D platformer, like I said earlier, is rare, so this is a breath of fresh air to me. Speaking of that platforming, it sure is something strange to get used to, at least it was for me when I first started playing. That's primarily because of the camera, to be fair. So obviously being in VR, you don't control the camera the same way you would in a traditional platformer, because, well, you're the camera. And man, do they do some cool things with that in this game. I especially love when you have to look up at Astro when he's jumping around above you. There's also something so exciting about being able to just take in all these environments more closely than you ever would be able to if this was just a standard game. I know that goes for most VR titles, but still, that feeling goes a long way. And just looking around isn't all they make you do with your head either. Oftentimes you'll have to hit things with your head or dodge out of the way of attacks or shake things off your face, and it helps to make the game feel even more immersive than it already was. And on the topic of the main gameplay, the platforming, it's good. As far as 3D platformers go, control-wise, this is very standard affair. Astro's moveset is especially pretty limited, but it feels polished and is still really fun for the most part. The game's not difficult at all either, with few exceptions, which is also fine, don't get me wrong. I'd say those are more than made up for by just how creative this level design is, though. Team Asobi managed to make all of these levels feel pretty exciting and unique from each other, which is saying a lot because realistically they're all just straight hallways. My favorite has to be this spooky one, Bots and Goblins, not just because I love the vibes and aesthetics, but because it has one of my favorite gimmicks in the entire game. So periodically the game will give you these boxes that have neat little gadgets in them for your controller. I'd say all of these are used pretty expertly. The hookshot, the water gun, the shurikens, the minigun, and the flashlight. They all feel fine-tuned, and like every bit of potential that could be squeezed out of them was. Well, with the exception of my favorite, sadly, the flashlight, which only gets used twice throughout the whole game. And that brings us back to that level I was talking about, because the flashlight has a very simple yet exceptionally fun gimmick. It reveals hidden platforms, which may not sound very exciting on the surface, but I think leads to some of the best level design in the game, and some cute visual references to other spooky games like Castlevania or Ghosts and Goblins or Sans? What the fuck? This isn't me trying to be funny either, this is definitely a reference to Undertale, and I gotta tell you, this left me so incredibly shocked when I first saw it. It's amazing that an indie game like Undertale managed to get a little cameo for sure, I just would have never expected it in this game of all things. Moving on from that bombshell, I guess, the gadgets are also used pretty well in boss fights, I think. And I love the sense of scale these guys have too. They're all gigantic and very imposing. Some of them are also very weird. I really don't know what to make of this one. Why does this game just keep hitting me in the face with whammy after whammy like this? Whatever, I want to talk about the final boss, so let's talk about the final boss. I really like this part of the game. It's always cool to fight an enemy that's perfectly matched with you for the most part. You see, this boss has his very own giant DualShock 4, and alongside it, the very same gadgets you've been using up to this point. Well, barring the hookshot and flashlight, that is. And this fight only gets cooler once you manage to get through each attack pattern, because then you get to use that giant DualShock 4, and god is it a hell of a thrill. Bringing this guy up also reminds me that I completely forgot to talk about this game's story, which, to be fair, is because this plot is nothing. This big bad alien guy steals the headset off of Astro's spaceship, which in turn causes other parts of it alongside the crew to be scattered across several different planets. So it's up to you and Astro to rescue the crew and get the ship in full working order again. And that's it. Good enough motivation to get the player going for sure, but it's not much else than that. Of course it doesn't need to be, but you can see why I neglected to bring it up to this point, right? And to get a little ahead of myself again, Astro's Playroom also doesn't have much going for it in the story department. Hell, I would say it doesn't have a story at all, actually. That transitions us pretty cleanly into our next game too, I think, so let's get into Astro's Playroom. Alright, we're finally onto the most recent entry in the Astro series, and the first to be developed by Team Asobi, but not under the Japan Studio moniker. I'm not gonna lie, that fact is pretty depressing to me, but there's a silver lining though at least. While Japan Studio no longer exists, I'm happy to say that several of the internal teams split off into their own studios and didn't just go down with the ship. And on a lighter note, let's get into the meat of this game, which... wow, this plays exactly like Rescue Mission. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. There are some major changes, but for the most part, if you've played its predecessor, you know what to expect from this one. Astro has all the same moves he had prior, and feels pretty much the same to control. Maybe he's just a teensy bit heavier? Honestly, I can't tell if there's a difference or not, so let that show how similar both games feel. And on the topic of those major changes I was talking about, the most obvious one is the camera. Since we're not in VR anymore, Astro's Playroom gets to have a more traditional camera for a 3D platformer. This is significant because this change affects more than just how you look around in the game. It also allows the level design to be more open due to not being railroaded into essentially a straight line for the whole experience. This is something Astro's Playroom definitely has over Rescue Mission, if only for the fact that the game feels more alive this way and that these places feel more like actual locations rather than, well, like I said, straight lines. That feeling is also made better by the visual design seeing a stark improvement over Rescue Mission. And again, Rescue Mission looks really nice, especially for a PSVR game like I said, but there are a lot of things in Astro's Playroom that they took from Rescue Mission and gave a hell of a sheen to. Most noticeably, this lighting. So Rescue Mission's lighting could look a little flat sometimes, but in Astro's Playroom, yeah, you'll never see anything like that here. This game, in general, just looks amazing. As I already said, the lighting is fantastic, but the character and environment design work mixed with the high texture and model quality leads to a game that just looks damn fine. And on a technical level, this game is even more impressive. Let's talk about the DualSense for a second. This controller is perfect. It's easily my favorite of all time now. It feels fantastic to hold, it has great weight to it, and the tech behind it is really neat. The HD rumble, which is used a lot more often and effectively than the Switch has ever used it, and the adaptive triggers make games more immersive than I thought a controller could do. The game shows these features off so well too, with various little gimmick sections that are also shockingly just fun to play. Maybe with the exception of this ball part, it's not awful, but it's definitely my least favorite of these sections. Still on the topic of showing off tech, man, am I blown away by the PS5 solid state drive. Prior to playing Astro's Playroom, I had never really experienced what SSDs could do, and as someone who grew up with loading screens galore, seeing them become essentially a thing of the past this generation is wild. Not that I'm complaining, as much of a nostalgic fool I can be, loading screens are one thing I'm not gonna miss that much. And on the topic of nostalgia, if you grew up with PlayStation consoles like me, this will hit you hard. The artifacts that are all just old peripherals and consoles, the mural showing various references to PlayStation history, the various platforms and background elements made out of PlayStation paraphernalia, the final boss, which is an amazing reference to one of the first ever demos for the original PlayStation, or God, the cameos. Constantly and consistently while playing, you'll run into these little scenes referencing games that are either exclusive to PlayStation consoles or at least got their starts on them. I won't be going over all of these, there are like 60 of them after all, but I appreciate the inclusion as a fan of a lot of these games, even if it is just pretty clear pandering really. But hey, honestly, sometimes I like being pandered to. And for something that's ultimately free, I can't complain even if I wanted to. Okay, that's not true, I can complain about anything, like this stupid gacha machine. This is actually a feature in all of these games except the original Playroom, and each one is just padding. Sure, you get cute little trinkets I suppose, but the amount of coins you have to save up to get everything in each game is annoying, and you will have to grind for it, if even just a little bit. Something else that's a constant in at least Rescue Mission and Astro's Playroom is challenge levels. In Astro's Playroom it's just time trials, which are fun but laughably easy. Rescue Mission on the other hand has more variety with its challenges, and some of them can actually be kind of tough. Not a huge fan of the boss ones where you can't get hit or else you might as well just start over, didn't like that in Mario Galaxy and I don't like it here either. Also, if you're wondering why I'm bringing this aspect of Rescue Mission up now and not earlier, I have a very good reason. I forgot. Anyway, let's wrap this up already. So, that caveat I brought up at the beginning of the video, right? As much as I enjoy the Astro series, more realistically just Rescue Mission and Astro's Playroom, in comparison to Japan Studio's other work, these just aren't as impressive or memorable in my opinion. They have a lot going for them for sure, especially when talking about other modern PlayStation series, but I can't help but feel that these games kind of don't hold a candle to the other great works this studio has put out, let alone the other platformers they put out like Ape Escape or Puppeteer. Not Knack though. It is not hard to be better than Knack.
Spaghetti and meatballs.
But again, that's only in comparison to the rest of Japan Studio's output. Looking at the Astro series on its own, these are still very solidly made games brimming with fun game mechanics and wonderful visual design that I would definitely say are worth your time. It's not like they're very long either, all of the various playrooms are very short, even the latest one, and if you have the physical ability to do so, Rescue Mission could be finished in one sitting if you're up for standing in the same spot for about 5 to 6 hours. So you know, if you work in retail, you're built for that game. The Astro series isn't my favorite thing Japan Studio has put out, and they may not have the most in-depth mechanics despite still being fun, or the longest playtimes, or the highest difficulty of any games out there, but they are still indelibly charming, and I'm excited to see what this series has in store for the future.